All right, week 7. First reading, Words Their Way, chapter 7. As in other chapters, this teacher uses word sorts. It seems word sorts are the main way to go about understanding the difference and similarities in words. ER, OR, and AR pose challenges for people, even adults. How would this work in a high school classroom for a group of juniors, I wonder? As this stage, syllables and affixes stage, mostly applies to middle schoolers, I found it interesting that the author suggests the stage shifts toward content knowledge instead of word building on page 242. With an emphasis on making meaning, the stage breaks off from the typical learning. I refer back to the eighth grade teacher whose classroom I sat in for 2 months, who was teaching students about prefixes and suffixes and meaning behind those words. This is what I thought was more derivational, but I think it seems this stage is an overlap to the beginning of derivational. My question for the reading revolves around the idea that intermediate writers can be expected to revise their written work and to edit it for spelling and punctuation accuracy on page 243. I bring this up because I have learned that we are not supposed to expect spelling accuracy. We are supposed to encourage their writing as expressive thought, unhindered by the tethers of stopping to spell things or revising for spelling instead of thought and content. The exercise posted talks about looking for prefix RE, but on the previous page, it talks about the errors the student made in reference to the words manager, radical, music, and awesome. You can't find a base word in music. It can be a base word for musical or musician, but that's not what the student wrote. The book suggests using a graphic organizer to explore the relationship between words, but how do you know which words to focus on? Just because one student misspelled music in their paragraph doesn't mean you need to stop class and have a mini lesson on the words related to music, especially if it has nothing to do with the focus of the content lesson. So much time is spent in a high school classroom on other skills that taking time out for this type of lesson seems a waste of time. I can see covering the academic vocabulary when it comes up, for example, evaluate. I can see taking a few minutes out to explore how evaluate can come in different forms evaluation, value, etc. I can see using the words students confuse as a basis for the younger grades, but I feel like high school students learning content specific vocabulary would benefit from a different approach. Honestly, if I had to teach this kind of literacy, I would ask the district for a specific literacy teacher. There's too many things to have to think about and remember. For example, why is actor with an A, I'm sorry, why is actor with an OR but porter is with an ER when they both make an sound? They are both a person who does something and have a base word that ends in T. As usual, I appreciate the activities listed in the book for helping students in this stage. If I were forced to teach elementary literacy, I would certainly reference this book for activity ideas. Reading number 2, Spelling in Parts, a strategy for spelling and decoding polysyllabic words. Chunking is probably one of the best ways to learn or accomplish any task. I wasn't surprised at the statistic of how many students fall behind in spelling by fourth grade and are poor readers. I distinctly remember when my oldest was in fourth grade and her teacher and the school changed their policy and no longer cared about proper spelling. I was outraged. My daughter was not a good speller, but she read constantly. They should never have stopped spelling requirements starting in fourth grade. Now she's fine, but I know she struggled a bit with her writing in law school. Graphosyllabic instruction is a new word for me. I think I'm also confusing the messages we've received about sounding out words. Somehow I had it in my mind that we read not to teach by having them sound it out. The example in the text is having the student sound out, spell, and identify areas that they think may cause them trouble. It's good to have students think about their thinking and realize where they may struggle. They can devote time themselves to figuring that out. When I was young, I struggled with a cursive R, so I practiced and still struggle today when I'm writing too fast anyway. There has to be kids out there that will want to practice when faced with a challenge. As a musical learner myself, I appreciate mnemonic devices to help me remember things. It's not a device, but clapping along to syllables can help students not to run letters together or emit letters for sounds. So here's where I always get stuck. The article explains that in the Midwest, they mispronounce the RU in February to February. How do you justify that? We expect students to learn and understand things, but this is a blatant example of ignoring the proper pronunciation. I can imagine students being suspect and not wanting to trust the teacher at that point. What other words and sounds does this apply to? Take the word library, for example. It's not library. If we are purposely mispronouncing words, how do we expect students to spell them correctly? The word pie is pronounced pa in the South. How does a teacher approach the sound of IE, I, when it sounds similar to an ah instead of a long I sound? Third reading, syllabic versus morphemic analyses. This is basically the same as the other article in talking about breaking words into sounds or syllables to read multisyllabic words. Older students who are on a much lower reading level may struggle with being able to identify syllables. I've never heard of the connectionist approach, but it makes sense. Finding fewer patterns is easier than trying to remember more patterns. This group still needs instructions on bases and affixes, even though they are in high school. What I found interesting is that in working with root words, students will not know the definitions or meanings of these words. For example, predict does not mean expect, it means to guess. I asked a small group of 11th graders in the science class I was subbing in today if they knew what it meant. The three of them all said to guess at something that will happen in the future, which is correct. I think for older students, the point still revolves around meaning making. Yes, they need to spell something, but they need to understand what something means. I think high school ELA teachers spend more time focusing on meaning making. Responsible means accountable, not in control. You can be responsible for something, but not necessarily in control. So, in covering these root words, we must practice their meanings and then focus on how the meaning changes when adding prefixes or suffixes. I've heard many teachers complaining about how far behind kids are now due to COVID and the lost classroom time. I would be interested to read about spelling development and instruction with all of these kids who are very behind in their literacy learning. I like the idea that this reading suggests a flexible method of grouping syllables. I think that allowing a student to group in a way that makes sense to them, it will help them to learn more quickly. If you force a way, they may not get it. I also don't think syllable and morpheme segmentation should be taught together. It will confuse the person. If I can separate domestication into domestication, then I'm doing it based on what I'm hearing. But the reading says to do morphemes, domestication. I get that it's easier to separate into two parts instead of five, and that domestic is a root word they need to learn. If we were doing this based on sounds, then I could see a student confusing the morpheme by saying domestication. With instruction, they would realize that cation is not a suffix, but they may still struggle when it comes time to spelling it on their own. Article 4, I don't know how to spell it. Unfortunately, the only time students can write in their native language is when they are in an ENL classroom, and they are in a newer stage of entering school, such as entering an immersion as their ENL level. Once they enter transitioning for ENLs, the expectation is that they only write in English. Multilingual schools don't exist here. Bilingual, yes, but not multilingual. And the bilingual schools that do exist are only for Spanish speakers. We don't really value other languages here in the US. I heard a joke once from a Chinese person who claimed that they were illiterate in 4 languages. The issue is that made up spellings in multiple languages is problematic. I'm not saying students should become proficient in English so that they are at least good at one language, but I think we need to be careful about allowing misspellings in multiple languages. The reading suggests using the same method as the others, sounding out the sounds to help with spelling. Students would have to know the rules about their home language to understand what letters make what sounds. In Korean, for example, a B or a P sound changes based on where in the word it occurs and how it is aspirated. It's the same with G and K. If the student doesn't know the rule, it will result in the wrong word. Korean has many words that sound the same but are spelled differently because of those aspirated or non aspirated sounds. Saying that the person will understand what you're trying to say, even if you misspell it, is an all right approach, but it's problematic. In my experience subbing in ENL classes, there aren't other peers who speak a language that can help the student. If one speaks Chinese, it is more likely the other student or students in the room does not. I had a case of a Russian girl who was new in school. They were asking a Ukrainian boy who was in a completely different classroom and at a different grade to help her once because he had some Russian language experience. The other student in the class with her was French. But he was a 5th grader and she was a 6th grader, the two children who spoke Russian, and his knowledge was too limited to make a big impact. There isn't someone available usually who can be that peer resource. Unfortunately, Google Translate is highly, highly unreliable. It's really upsetting to have seen it focused on that much in the book. I would never tell an ENL student to use it unless it was absolutely necessary. The poor Russian girl, when working with a student from Russia, Google Translate was utterly laughable. The translations weren't even close. Korean, for example, uses honorifics, and Google Translate does not catch them very often. Thanks for listening.